I think that a lot of times you kind of want to have an explainable narrative, an explainable life story. I think it's like the rational brain always wants you to be able to tell the story about how, I trained at Yale and then I went to Stanford and I published great papers, right? Okay. And then did all these great life sciences things from there. And in truth, no one says that your life story has to fit a neat template.
Right.
You can take all kinds of twists and turns. There are lots of, people who have had careers that span all kinds of different areas and all kinds of different topics. Or I think of great scientists, for instance, who, like Leo Szilard, for instance, who was on the one hand a great physicist, who was, instrumental in uncovering the nature of the atom, and there's all the Manhattan Project. But then he got involved in ethics and sort of advising the U.S. government on the use of nuclear weapons. Then he got into biology.
Right.
He made some sort of key discoveries around the regulation of gene expression. People take all, and there's nothing sort of logical about that flow. It's really a ping pong. And there are examples I can think of that even are a little bit sort of jumpier.
Welcome to the Maximus podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sepah. As a clinical psychologist, medical school professor, and CEO, I specialize in helping men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. On this podcast, I interview extraordinary men as a clinician would, hearing their come-up stories of how they became the men that they are today, and having them share their secrets of actionable advice on how to look, feel, and perform your best. All right, well, welcome to the Maximus podcast. I am super excited to have our guest today, Sebastian Caliri, who is an entrepreneur and investor. So Sebastian completed a year of the MD program at Stanford University and holds a BS and MS, magna cum laude, in Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry from Yale University. And Sebastian is now a venture capitalist investor at 8VC, who invests in both consumer and enterprise companies with a particular focus on healthcare. He is also an investor in Maximus. And so he's a colleague, and we're super excited to have you on as a guest today.
Good to see you, Cameron, and thank you for inviting me on.
My pleasure, and it's a pleasure to have you. So I always like to start off with a little bit of a softball question. Since you are an investor in Maximus, I'd love to hear your perspective and sharing to the world why you decided to invest in our company.
Well, fundamentally, it's belief in you as a CEO. I think that it's interesting comparing seed investing, which is part of what we do at 8VC, to sort of how you look at a Series A or a Series B stage deal. Because with a seed, you've got a founder and maybe a slide deck, maybe it's just a conversation. And you just don't have a whole lot to go on except for your feel for the CEO, your feel for the founding team. So, fundamentally, this is an endorsement of your decision making. And fundamentally, that's why I got excited about investing in Maximus. I think we were your first investors. That
is correct. Yes.
Is that correct?
You're also the first people that I went to. So a vote of confidence in both ways. But yeah, very much appreciate that. It's very humbling to hear. And it's a good point, seed stage investing is such a, lottery ticket in some ways. Obviously some companies do phenomenal. A lot of companies burn out. And so I do think you have to have faith in the team. People talk about that a lot. So, and I think that goes both ways for entrepreneurs as well. You should go to investors that you like and trust, and obviously we've had a pre-existing relationship, and obviously love 8VC. So it's awesome to be able to work together, and awesome to be able to dig in and share some of your lessons and wisdom here today on the rest of the podcast. Yeah. Excellent. So what we like to do at the beginning of this podcast is this segment which we call Making the Man. Because you might have been on other podcasts or been interviewed many times about your opinions about tech and investing and all the things you have such deep expertise in. But people never hear the backstory of how people came to be as successful or wise or whatnot as they are. So one of the unique things we try to do is to hear that backstory. So I'd love to kind of almost like go back to the beginning I understand that you are from Andover, Massachusetts. So I'd love to hear just a little bit of, your story about, what your upbringing was like there, and what it was like in Andover.
Yeah, yeah. So very sort of standard upper middle class upbringing, if I
Mhm.
had to distill it down. Um, Andover is a nice suburb of Boston,
Mhm.
notably the home of Jay Leno. I think he's our most famous resident.
Nice.
Uh, or, um, but um, but very standard sort of upper middle class upbringing, right?
Mhm.
My parents grew up in Somerville and Medford, and so for those of us who don't necessarily have a lot of familiarity with the Boston area, these are sort of like Italian enclaves, or at least they were
Mhm.
in the 50s and 60s when they were growing up. My
Mhm.
grandparents were, classic immigrant families, classic immigrant working class families. So my parents grew up in that environment and were
Mhm.
sort of the first generation to go to college. Like many people of their generation, they decided to move out to the suburbs when they had
Mhm.
kids, and grew up in a nice house with a yard, two cars, and occasionally got to go on vacations once or twice to Disney World, and went to public school.
Mhm.
Uh, Part of the reason why we moved to Andover is because pretty solid just public schools.
Right.
And so went to the public elementary school, went to the public middle school. And I think that really things started to change for me and things got interesting in eighth grade.
Mm.
So, Andover, ironically, we had moved there because of the good public schools.
Mhm.
Ironically, ended up getting into a great private school.
Mm.
So Phillips Academy Andover is a well-known boarding school
Totally.
in town, and every year they'll take a couple of local sort of middle school students and admit them and have them join on as day students.
Mhm.
So it's primarily a boarding school, right? People are
Right.
coming from across the country living on campus. You'll pick a couple local kids and you'll live at home, but I was lucky enough to get in,
Yeah.
and that's sort of what I think fundamentally put me on a different trajectory. And we can talk about where we go from there.
Sure.
But that was huge for me and a huge sort of source of opportunity in my life.
Absolutely. I mean, for folks who don't know, it's like pretty much like the Harvard of private, high
Or,
schools.
or the Yale.
Or yeah, it's true. I had to rub that in, but no, I'm actually really curious. That must have been, yeah, very much a life transformative experience. In that, obviously a lot of the kids who do go to that high school go on to the Harvards and Yales and Stanfords of the world. It is like a very prestigious rank of accomplishment. Obviously, a very rigorous school for folks to go through. Was that transition difficult? Like, especially going from, you're probably, I imagine, like smart kid. It's probably not too hard to get through middle school, and then all of a sudden, you're thrown into school, very, very elite, probably a competitive environment. There's a pressure to like go to the great college. I'm curious what that transition was like for you, and what is it? I think people would be interested to hear what is an elite boarding school like?
Yeah. So first, huge culture shock
Right.
when I first got there. So all of a sudden, Andover is a pretty homogenous community, right?
Mm.
I remember in kindergarten, we had some exercise where it's like, you had to identify, are you Catholic? Are
Hmm.
you Jewish, or both? It's basically like Italian, Irish Catholic, and then, small Jewish population as well.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, there's kids from New York City who are already like smoking cigarettes and
Hmm.
like, have gone through a divorce and but no, I felt the New York kids really had a lot of like life experiences that
Sure.
I didn't necessarily have. And there are kids wearing pink pants and playing squash
Right.
and growing crew. And I'm like, what is all of this stuff? A lot of things I just hadn't really been exposed to. So certainly a bit of culture shock, but
Sounds like it.
it's truthfully it's a pretty welcoming place,
Mm.
Phillips Academy, and I think it's similar in some ways to schools like Harvard and Yale, where they anticipate that there's going to be people from across the country with all different life experiences and all different backgrounds, and they try to make everyone feel welcome.
Right.
And I think that the faculty that they hire really sort of communicate that openness and really try to get everyone to realize their potential. And I benefited a lot from that close attention. I benefited a lot from the quality of instruction. I think it's like there are a lot of adults who go through life and they have jobs and they're just jobs.
Sure.
And they show up to work 9 to 5 and it's a paycheck.
Right.
The faculty at Andover are incredibly passionate about what they do. And I think that even when I got to Yale, I didn't encounter people who were so devoted to their craft.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think it really honors teaching as a profession and a calling in a lot of ways. That's in fact one of the reasons I continue to teach at UCSF, even though I don't need to, is I really enjoy it. I do think it is like a big part of like my values and public service. So I'm glad that you had teachers in high school who were able to impart that. I'm kind of curious, during your time there, you have one of the things I think is impressive about those kinds of schools, there's so many options, right? There's like a million sports you can play, a million extracurriculars, so many different subjects, probably extra subjects than even at a typical high school. So I'm kind of curious, what captured your curiosity between 14 and 18? What did you really like or get into during that period of time?
So, I mean, there's a lot of things. It really was a sort of, I just remember sitting down and looking at the course catalog. It's like, there's Japanese, I could take Japanese. There's
right.
There's all different history courses. There are all of these English classes I can take and art history. And I just remember being so excited, getting ready to start my freshman year. And so the short answer is lots of things captured my attention. The slightly longer answer is, one, I decided to take Chinese, and after surveying a bunch of the language courses, I figured, look, if you're in a school like this where you have so many options, shouldn't just stick to Spanish, French, whatever. But I think perhaps more important to my life story is I really developed interest in the sciences, in biology and physics in particular. I think that some of this goes back to my upbringing, where Massachusetts at the time was really developing its sort of like life sciences, biopharmaceutical economy. And so when you looked at the Boston Globe, which, back in an era when people still read paper newspapers, there's a lot of stuff going on in biotech and life sciences. And I think the other side of this is, I was actually born blind in my right eye. And so I've always had an interest in medicine, and I've always had an interest in sort of these biological processes. And so Andover really just opened up a door for me to explore these interests. And so I particularly found a home with a lot of the STEM courses there.
Yeah, amazing. And then obviously you went on to study science at Yale. And tell me a little bit about that decision and what that experience was like now that you're, focusing on it and in college.
Yeah. So when I got to Yale, I think I had a pretty good sense that I wanted to do something in the life sciences. And so we had two different biology majors, one of them more quantitative, which is what I did, one of them less so. And I loved my major. Just like Andover, I think there was a real devotion to the craft of teaching in the molecular biophysics and biochemistry department. And I think that was something that I definitely benefited from. I think that, and we'll start to get into this as we, play things forward into medical school and when I actually start working. But I think that at the time, I didn't necessarily know anything other than the sort of track of get good grades and good things will happen afterwards.
Sure, right.
And so I think that this is like a helpful mental model and also a very harmful mental model. I was a very, very devoted student at Yale. And so and so I ended up spending a lot of time in the library, a lot of time in the lab, got great grades, and this propelled me into a great medical school. But it was certainly a trade-off. And there were a lot of things at Yale that I didn't necessarily get to take advantage of as well. But overall, I'm glad I picked the major. It's often hard to envision your life playing out in any way other than the way it did.
Right.
And I'm not sure I necessarily would have done a lot differently.
Yeah, the funny thing is I was having a conversation with a friend about this because I probably had a very similar experience in college, and I was told to get good grades because I knew that that would get me into grad school. And so it's easy to look back and be like, oh, I would have loved to have more fun or been more involved. But on the other hand, I was like, well, I don't think I would have actually gotten into grad school if that was the case. So how do you think about this? And the reason I asked this in particular is I think certainly in our generation, education was seen as the stepping stone to success. Nowadays, especially in this distributed Zoom era, people are even questioning the value of not only graduate education, but even a college education. So, having had the privilege of kind of going through and getting an elite education, I'm curious, what like do you think it is worthwhile, or are there for there certain people or certain tracks that they should go take the traditional path and get those good grades like you're talking about, or have you become sort of more open and flexible to alternative models of education?
There are no easy answers to this question because, to your point, if you don't focus on academics, then certain doors close to you. Right? If you want to go into medicine, if you want to go into law, if you want to get into a top PhD program, you absolutely need to focus on your academics.
Right.
However, I think that everything has opportunity costs. And so by making that choice to be very sort of like a very serious student, you're also closing other doors, right? You're keeping some doors open, you're closing other doors. And I talked to probably 2 or 3 Yale undergrads a week. So I love to make myself there are lots of people in my life that gave me a lot of great guidance and helped me out. And so literally whenever a Yale or an Andover student reaches out, I will always schedule time with them and speak candidly about my experiences. And the advice that I tend to give is not, oh, take school seriously or don't take school seriously. It's like, be intentional about whatever choice you make. Don't simply fall into a pattern. Don't let someone else make decisions for you. Don't let a culture make decisions for you. I think that on a practical level, what I tend to suggest is if you have the opportunity to take a year off, either before you start school or a year or two into it, this can be a clarifying experience. It can expose you to sort of like the range of things available to you in the real world beyond.
Right.
And I think that if there are certain things that are interesting to you, you might be better certain careers in industry. You might be better served by spending your time at school differently than if you're sort of orienting yourself towards medical school, orienting yourself towards graduate school. You could have never convinced an 18-year-old Sebastian that like taking a year off would be a good idea, right? Sure. But in retrospect, or when I talk to students today, this is always something I bring up.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think of all the people that I've known that have taken time off, none of them actually ever regretted it in the end, right? But I definitely knew people otherwise who probably wish they took some time off in between things. But yeah, it's hard as an 18-year-old, to your point, to have that sort of long-term view. I mean, my point of view when I was going through that in my early 20s was I just want to get done with school as fast as possible so that I can get out and work. I think the thing that you miss with that attitude is it's true. Like it's nice to be able to move on with your life and work. But on the other hand, it puts you on a certain track and you may finish early, but you realize that's not even what I wanted to finish or should have finished in the first place. So that perspective is very helpful.
Yeah, I think that unless you seek it out, you're very rarely, and this is, I think, one of the criticisms I have of education in this country in general. It's unless you kind of seek out this question, no one really forces you to think too hard about what kind of life you want to live or what kind of person you want to be. And it's funny because then you get, you're a graduate of these schools now. It's like, you can do whatever you want.
Absolutely.
And this is sort of like the first time that you're encountering this question. Why shouldn't this be a focus earlier? I really wish that this is something we put more emphasis on. It's like encouraging people to think about what sort of life they want to live and encouraging them to think about what they want to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think at the time that I was at Harvard, there was a course on positive psychology. I believe there's an equivalent course actually at Yale now. probably a different title. It's sort of about the science of well-being and flourishing and the life that you want to live. I think even ironically, Stanford has a similar course, and they're, to my recollection, some of the most popular courses on campus, because it was the rare opportunity to be like, okay, don't just memorize and regurgitate material, but like think deeply about these questions of like, who do you want to be? What do you want to do with your life? And also some frameworks to think about. Okay, probably if you operate, by certain means, you're probably going to have a better life. So it's very useful to give that. And I agree. I wish it was almost like a mandatory part, of education. So take me through. Okay, you're a senior now at Yale. You have the world at your fingertips in terms of the almost maybe the paradox of choice, as Barry Schwartz calls it, of you can do too many things. Tell me about your decision to, go to medical school.
So I think that in retrospect, this was the continuation of me applying this mental model of get good grades, good things will happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's this very sort of like logical thing to do as a life science major with great grades from Yale. It's like, you could get into a PhD program or you can get an MD. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
An MD, you can do a lot with that, opens up a lot of doors. It's prestigious. Nobody will ask too many questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then I think, growing up, I had some inkling of an idea that I would want to do something in industry in the life sciences or healthcare. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the sort of like role models that I had in the Boston area, Boston is a town run by academics. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the role models that I had were people who had gotten their PhD, people had gotten their MD, then become, tenured professors at Harvard or MIT. And then like when you're 50 and well published, then Third Rock or some flagship gets on the phone with you and gives you the call to start a company.
Right.
But this is just the mental model I had. Yes. So I think the confluence of that and sort of medical school being the obvious sort of thing to do, the popular thing to do, led me to apply. Yep. And I think things started to get interesting with a dinner that I actually had my senior year. So 2012 was the second year of the Thiel Fellowship. And I was fortunate to have a couple of friends who were in that first class of Thiel Fellows. I think of the 20, there were maybe.
And can you explain to our audience, for maybe not everyone who is familiar with the Thiel Fellowship, what it is?
Yeah, so this was a program started by Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, and then chairman of the board at Palantir, co-founder of Palantir, where he and a couple of the folks at the Thiel Foundation, which is his charitable arm, as well as Thiel Capital, all got together and decided, hey, there's a lot of students who are in school today who, kind of like I was describing earlier, right? Very well might be interested in starting a company.
Right.
Very well could be good entrepreneurs with the skills they have today, but aren't really given an outlet to explore something different than school. And so the Thiel Fellowship, at its inception, I think it's more or less the same today, identifies about 20 students every year who are either recent graduates of high school or some of them have already started college and decided to drop out. But you get $100,000, and that you're allowed to use that to start your own business.
Yep,
that's the fundamental idea.
Yep, and for people who follow the news, it's very controversial at times because they're like, billionaire convinces kids to drop out of college for $100,000, to pursue entrepreneurial ventures, which at the time I think was almost controversial. But nowadays, a lot of students are very, very eager to pursue that path and drop out for much less, quite honestly, because I think the model of certainly Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, many other folks have successfully adopted that model and probably were much more successful for doing so. So you were at this dinner, and it was involved with the Thiel folks were involved.
Yeah. So what happened was a couple of folks from the Thiel Foundation had come to campus along with the Yale Thiel Fellows in order to sort of recruit and get the message out. And Peter Thiel, I think, has a very sort of unique approach to talent.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he just tries to find smart people wherever they are and include them in something in his universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the folks from the Thiel Foundation, the Thiel Fellows, put together a dinner, and every Thiel Fellow was asked to invite a handful of their smart friends.
Mm.
And I was fortunate enough to get the call, and at this dinner, I think I met a bunch of folks from the Thiel universe,
mm-hmm.
and I think they come into play a little bit later in my story. But I established that connection. I was kind of on the fence between Johns Hopkins and Stanford, where I wanted to go to medical school,
right.
And I think this may have. It's hard to say, right? What
Sure.
influences your decision making, but I think that this may have swayed me to go to Stanford and be closer to these folks in Northern California. They certainly sold Northern California pretty well. But yeah, so this dinner, I ended up getting in touch with folks associated with Thiel Fellowship, and we can get into it. But these are folks that ultimately helped me make the decision, and I think influenced me in my decision-making process to actually leave medical school a year into it.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I think it's a great lesson for our listeners too, is like the Thiel strategy of, finding the best talent. And it's, easier said than done, but what a simple and brilliant tactic of just invite all your smartest friends, right? And find all the smart people, because smart people congregate around other smart people, or as in business world, we like to say A players like to work with A players. And that's a great way of building a network. So I think it's very applicable, whether you're networking, building a company, or finding great people to work with. Very, very applicable lesson there. Okay, so you decide to go west, as they say, and kind of follow your dreams at Stanford. Obviously, great medical school, and you have this very straightforward path lined up before you, right? Do your 4 years of medical school, do your approximately 4 years of residency, and then become a esteemed clinician scientist path. So I'm sure, especially not just college, but medical school, where you've already done the hard work, right? You're already in there. Most people obviously graduate medical school. There's a joke, in fact, that what do you call the last the person who's last in their class at medical school? You still call them doctor. So it'd be very easy to take that path. So tell me about this really interesting decision that you're 1 year into medical school to drop out.
Yeah, I think the facade all comes crumbling down somewhere in year one of medical school. And man, I got red pilled hard by that experience. I think, I came in with a certain mindset, as we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm.
And in medical school, I think this ideal of compliance is taken to its extreme. It's sort of like, just take the test, memorize the thing. It's so much memorization.
Right.
Memorize the thing and don't ask too many questions. And as long as you don't ask too many questions, you'll be okay. You'll get this nice job as a doctor and everything's going to be wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But on the weekends, I was hanging out with some of these folks from the Thiel Foundation. And, these are people who are always asking you questions, good questions that made me think about the opportunity cost of being in school. It's a conscious decision. What am I giving up by doing this?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, I was incredibly frustrated by some of the things I think we were asked to do in medical school were outright insulting. Memorize all the bones in your wrist. Well, why? They all have names.
Sure.
Here we go. The scaphoid. Great. When is this ever useful in actually taking care of patients?
Yeah.
Memorizing antibiotic names. It's you can look that up on an app on your phone. And at a certain point, I'm extremely good at memorizing things. I can do it. It's great. But all well and good. And I do like learning.
Of course.
But at a certain point, the dissonance of what I was being asked to do and what it was kind of notionally preparing me to do, it was just too much to take.
Yeah. By the way, I'm really curious about that, because you obviously were a very good student. You kind of played by the rules of the system, so to speak. Where does the rebelliousness streak come from? Was it always there and it's kind of suppressed because you were bright and ambitious? Or it really just took the hammering to kind of bring it out completely?
No, I think I've always had a bit of that in me. I think that to some extent, people are always like rebelling against their father a little bit.
Sure, right.
And my father is a very, I mean, he has lots of redeeming qualities, and I love him. However, he is certainly on the risk averse side of the
Yeah,
spectrum.
right.
And I suspect that paired with, as a kid, I was very protected, because it's like, oh, Sebastian is blind in one eye. We don't, we don't want anything to happen to him.
Yeah.
I think that this brought out, I think, a reaction
Mm,
where I think I'm a little bit more risk tolerant. I have a little bit more appetite for risk
yeah.
as a result of that in my
Makes
upbringing.
sense. Yeah, and that's such a useful insight. So we are very much a product of our environment, especially our parents. Influences. Either we follow it or we rebel against it. But one way or the other, you're influenced either way. So I'm curious, what was their reaction when you told them, "Hey, mom and dad, thank you for all the support, and I went through all this path, and I'm going to drop out of medical school."
That was one of the hardest conversations I think I've had in my life. I remember it distinctly. So I was up in the Presidio, San
Yeah.
Francisco, up by the Thiel Foundation
Uh-huh.
offices. And, I decided that I was going to leave my first
Mhm.
year medical school, after my first year medical school, and join this exciting technology company called Palantir.
Uh-huh.
And I think my parents just didn't get it.
Yeah.
I think that, no, I don't think anyone who knew me would have guessed that was going to happen.
Right.
Just being such a serious student. But I had sort of done the calculus and just felt, hey, I've just been following this track. I'm not
Mhm.
really sure I want to be a doctor.
Mm.
I'm doing this thing that will preserve optionality. But, as I alluded to earlier, I think I've always had this inkling of an idea. I want to do something in industry and healthcare, life sciences. And a bunch of people were opening this door to join an exciting technology company and work on
Mhm.
those very problems I cared about. And so I just wanted to seize on that opportunity.
Mm.
And I think that it just took time. I mean, again, it was a hard conversation.
For sure.
I think my parents really didn't get it. I think
Yeah.
they really didn't want me to leave medical school.
Mm.
Look, we got started with a leave of absence between 2 years, 2 years leave of absence. It
Right.
wasn't just ripping the Band-Aid at once.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it all got started.
Yeah. Well, very, very brave of you. I know it's not easy to have those conversations with your parents, who's particularly loved, financially supported you to get to go down that path. But in a lot of ways, I think being an adult is kind of becoming your own man. So I'm particularly curious, like why Palantir, right? There's a million things you can obviously do besides being a doctor, but switching to this government focused enterprise SaaS company would not be the expected choice, I would say, of someone who's taken another path. So what was appealing about it, and why were you like, okay, I'm not sure about this path, but this one sounds interesting to me?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think one thing to appreciate about Palantir at that time is, and we're in like right at the end of 2013.
Hmm.
Palantir was transitioning from a company focused, almost entirely on defense and intelligence,
Hmm.
to a whole range of different commercial customers.
Mm.
So you had pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, banks, what have you, knocking on Palantir's door and saying, "Hey, you've done such great work with the intelligence community. Can you help us
Mm.
with our fraud problem?"
Yeah.
And they made a couple of hires to just deal with this inbound interest.
Mm.
And given the caliber, so I had a few friends who worked at Palantir. I
Hmm.
had met people through the Thiel Foundation. I was very impressed by the caliber of the different Palantir employees I had met.
Hmm.
Um, seemed like a company on a good trajectory, and there was a role that just seemed like perfect fit for me.
Mm.
In my major at Yale, I had done some computational work and had, some experience with programming.
Hmm.
Um, and here was a role where I would be given sort of a canvas
Yeah.
to build something to transform our healthcare system
Hmm.
and use data to make health systems operate in a more efficient way,
Hmm.
to enable health plans, to accelerate drug development. I saw all of these possibilities in
Hmm.
front of me. And so Palantir just really appealed to me as a platform,
Right.
right? To have a lot of ownership, grow responsibility quickly, and build out a business doing things that I care a lot about. I'm
Right.
very excited to do.
Yeah, when you pitch it that way, it almost seems like a no-brainer. And I think there's such a valuable nugget of wisdom there too, in terms of the caliber of people, right? So much of, I think, the standard decision making that people make is always like, well, what's the right next step based on, what my interests are / the best opportunity is. And I think people actually neglect, to your point about your teachers at Andover, some of the influential people at Yale, but also the people that you were going to work with at Palantir, surrounding yourself with the best, brightest, and people also that you get along with, is actually a very useful way of picking it, even if it's not the perfect position, I would say, because quality of people trumps almost everything.
I think it's a great observation, and something that I end up talking a lot about when I have friends or former coworkers who ask about joining a startup.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if you're on a what's the phrase? A rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
If you are on a rocket ship, it doesn't matter what seat you're in.
Yeah.
So people worry, am I the VP of this or that? Am I the head of this or that? It's like, who cares?
Right.
If the team is awesome, you're gonna come out better for it.
Sure.
And so join on when you see top talent congregating around something.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very useful point of wisdom. I'm also curious because you had this little disillusionment experience where you're like, medical school is not exactly what you expected. How did you know you weren't going to repeat that with startups, right? Because they're also like, you watch a social network and you think that's what a startup is. How did you have greater confidence in making, switching into that new career?
I didn't. It's like, it was scary. And that was, on the one hand, late 2013, a very exciting time, but a very anxious time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I had resolved is there isn't really or what I was coming to appreciate is that there isn't necessarily like a golden right path for everybody. Sure. And at a certain point, you need to just trust intuition. Mm-hmm. And so, joining Palantir, I was taking a leave of absence from Stanford. I always had the optionality to go back if things didn't feel right. And I had resolved to trust my intuitions on this one and just see how this thing felt and go from there.
I imagine it's very hard for someone, because I can empathize with this, very scientific, analytical, to learn to trust intuition, right? But yeah, do you have any advice for folks on that? Like, if you are very left brain and quantitative and analytical, as a lot of probably our listeners are, to learn to become more intuitive or trust one's intuition?
Well, I think that a lot of times you kind of want to have an explainable narrative, an explainable life story. Mm-hmm. I think it's like the rational brain always wants you to be able to tell the story about how, I trained at Yale and then I went to Stanford and I published great papers, right? Okay. And then did all these great life sciences things from there. And in truth, no one says that your life story has to fit a neat template.
Right.
You can take all kinds of twists and turns. There are lots of, people who have had careers that span all kinds of different areas and all kinds of different topics. Or I think a great scientist, for instance, who, like Leo Szilard, for instance, who was on the one hand a great physicist, who was, instrumental in uncovering the nature of the atom, and then there's all the Manhattan Project. But then he got involved in ethics and sort of advising the U.S. government on the use of nuclear weapons. Then he got into biology. Right. He made some sort of key discoveries around the regulation of gene expression. People take all, and there's nothing sort of logical about that flow. It's really a ping pong. And there are examples I can think of that even are a little bit sort of jumpier. But you don't necessarily have to have a logical flow. It's nothing says it has to be the case.
Yeah, that's such a good lesson too. I think maybe there are certain fields, it's like you want to be the best violinist in the world, like start at age 3 and just keep practicing for 5 hours a day. But I think for most other people, maybe you in fact end up in a better place if you allow for this variability and a non-linear, non-straightforward path, because it probably opens you up to more opportunity and even cutting your losses when things aren't working out. So certainly better, I would say, to drop out of first year of medical school than, your last year of residency when you're 7 years into it. So I'm kind of curious. Okay, you're at Palantir. You spend 4 years there. You obviously learn a lot. You become sort of a technology expert. How did that kind of contribute to your? I'm actually less interested in your professional growth. I'm interested. How did it affect your personal growth? Because now you're out in the real world. You're not just memorizing wrist bones. You're dealing with the real people, real businesses, real customers. You're out on your own, right, for the first time, truly, away from the comfy confines of the academic bubble. How did that shape you as a man?
Well, I think that this was sort of my exposure to the way the world works. And I think whereas previously I'd been in these sort of like academic cocoons with sort of like well-trodden paths, like now you're in a startup and no one is going to tell you where to go or how to build the business and what decisions to take. Like you actually need to be autonomous. It was sort of like like my Matrix, like waking up moment. It's like you actually have to make decisions about your life now.
Right.
And I think that this is paired with a time in my life when I'm in like my early mid-20s and I'm deciding sort of like, okay, look, I have all of these Yale people I know who are out in San Francisco. And who do I want to spend time with? And what do I want to do outside of work? What kind of person do I want to be? This is sort of like when I became a fully formed human in my book. And it was scary and liberating. And I think that it was a process, over the 3 or 4 years at Palantir. I tried lots of different things, and some things I cut, some things I kept. To your point about careers, it's like, I think sometimes you just have to try. You have to be open to different possibilities, try things out a little bit, see how it feels, cut it if it doesn't work. But it's this iterative process by which sort of I discovered, what kind of person I wanted to be and what sort of things I wanted to spend my time on.
Yeah. That's I think that's incredibly insightful as well. I love the phrase, by the way, fully formed human being, because you're right. In some ways, being especially in a very academic bubble, it almost is like a delayed adolescence, right? Like you're on the one hand brilliant and can do your academic studies really well, but unfortunately universities don't train, I would say, well-rounded human beings. That's probably fair. Maybe there was a time that was not as true of the case. But I also love your point that, in order to become a fully formed human being, it's not just going off to your room and reflecting and journaling about it. It sounds like the way that you developed that was a lot through trial and error, right? It's just trying different things, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, seeing who you like, seeing who you don't like, and through that process of iteration, kind of becoming the person that you want to be. So I think that's a great lesson there, is it doesn't necessarily need to be this reflection in isolation, but it can be just kind of figuring it out along the way from real experiences.
It's a very like engineering approach, right? It's like you build software by putting together something that kind of works, but you're more or less embarrassed by. You put it in front of an end user, you see how they like it. 95% of it they hate, 5% of it they like. Okay, you retain the 5%, make another version, but you iterate towards a better solution. I think that for a lot of like very complex decisions, it's very challenging to divine a solution through reflection and sort of like stoically thinking in your room alone and journaling. No, it's like just got to try things and see how they feel. And iterate towards a better.
Absolutely. So you spend your time there, and tell me about the transition to now becoming an investor at 8VC and a venture capitalist. Where you're currently are today.
Yeah. So 4.5 years in at Palantir, we had discovered how we could sell to commercial customers. We had built out a platform that we sold to commercial customers, which didn't exist when I joined the company. And I think that, we had developed something of a playbook. And so in our healthcare business, it's like, we kind of knew what the big use cases were in pharma and health plans and health systems. And we kind of knew how to sell, how to get in the door and how to grow to accounts from there. And I think my learning slowed down. And I think on top of that, I was flying back and forth from SF to London and Frankfurt and Zurich every other week. And
Wow.
while great for my frequent flyer mile count, it was
Sure.
very bad for my health because, as I was getting it earlier, right, this is a period, the preceding years were a period where I really figured out what I liked and what kind of person I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved a couple of relationships I had
Yeah.
with friends who had similar intellectual interests,
Mm-hmm.
the history of science, philosophy of science,
Mm.
a couple of other areas, but I wanted to stay in touch with these people who I decided were people who were valuable to me, people who I really enjoyed, this sort of intellectual partnership. And traveling so much for me just made it hard to maintain these relationships.
Totally.
So in early 2018, I decided that with all these things coming together, the time was right to leave. And actually didn't know what I wanted to do when I left, but I knew, and I probably had the first inklings of an idea that it was time to leave in, I don't know, 2017. And not knowing precisely what I wanted to do, made it a process to work up the courage to leave. But ultimately is like, okay, you can keep putting this off forever, or you can just rip the Band-Aid off. And so decided to leave, didn't know what I wanted to do, and took about a month off to relax, clean my room, all the rest. And then started talking with all of the people I knew in my network who were doing interesting things in healthcare. And through this process, I ended up doing a little consulting on the side, just found some different opportunities to help build customer success and sales teams and different health IT startups. And one of these consulting gigs was actually with an AVC portfolio company. And so actually I had no idea. I would not have guessed that I would end up doing venture. I think that my thought coming out of Palantir is I'll probably do something in like a health insurance company, or maybe I'll join a health system or something like that. But ended up meeting some of the folks at 8VC through this consulting gig. And to the discussion we were having earlier about great teams and chemistry within teams, I started to just feel like, let's take a step back, right? Talent, 8VC had been doing more in healthcare, 2017, 2018. They're looking to grow the investment team, particularly someone with a focus on health IT and health services. And so met some of the people on the investment team, started talking about a role focused on healthcare. As I met more and more folks, it occurred to me, it's like, wow, this is a group of like really ambitious, really talented people who I get along with phenomenally well. This is a platform I want to attach myself to. And it's sort of like, okay, they happen to be a venture capital firm, but they could, that's sort of like incidental to the fact that this is like a team that I really want to be a part of. And in particular, Joe, who runs our firm, just really impressed me as someone who had a big vision. I had incredible depth in so many different areas. And I was convinced that, this guy is young. He's got his finger in a lot of things. I don't know where he's going to end up in a decade, but I want on this thing. And so I ended up joining in the summer of 2018.
Amazing. Yeah. And it's such a great story too of serendipity. It's nice to hear, when you're like, I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And through the consulting work, you kind of accidentally found your way there. But it sounds like, you're kind of repeating that framework of like, again, find the rocket ship, find the amazing people that I admire and get along with. And that's such a great rubric. It's funny. I was running with Joe not too long ago, and I was remarking how so much of the team he had actually worked with before, right? A lot of ex-Palantir folks. And I was kind of like half ribbing him a little bit and being like, this is probably the most incestuous team in venture capital, and that like you've worked with all these folks before, which I was like, either that's a bad idea or quite frankly, it's the most brilliant idea, because you probably have a very tight-knit, close-knit company culture of people who really get along well because there is history together and bonding, and you've kind of been through trials and tribulations together. And obviously, as I got to know the team, I obviously realized that was kind of his thesis, and it has kind of come true. So it's amazing, where you've turned out, and the success and trajectory of your career. One question I love to ask everyone. Obviously, you didn't need to go through all of that to get to where you are today, right? Nick, you don't have to go to medical school, obviously, to become a venture capitalist. I obviously didn't need to get a doctorate either to start a company. But knowing what you know now, obviously with the blessing of hindsight being 2020, would you have still gone through the steps that you would have gone through, or would you have liked to just skip fast track to doing what you're doing today?
It's sort of, and I think I made this point a little bit earlier too. It's like it's hard to envision your life having followed a very different trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many things that I like about the path that I took.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's funny. It's like you hear Peter Thiel, on the one hand, talk about the Thiel Fellowship, and it's like, would you have still gone to undergrad and law school? It's like, right. Yes, like I would have. And
I know, ironic.
Yeah. And I think to me, although I ended up leaving medical school, well, I also got the chance to see what an EMR is like. Yeah. I got to sit in a hospital and I got to work at the free clinic and see patients, which I loved. It was such a rewarding experience to actually participate in delivering care. And these perspectives and these experiences, I think, are all things I bring to bear in what I do today. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to see it any other way, really. Mm-hmm. And even things that, okay, maybe it seems superficial, I could have skipped. I don't know. I think that medical school actually gave me a lot of useful tools and experiences and learnings.
Totally. I think that's such a valuable point too. People always assume that the steps on their path needs to always make sense or be a logical or natural progression to their next step. It's nice if that's the case, but in a lot of ways, I think, certain things teach us what we don't like and we shouldn't do. And that's a useful lesson there. There may be lessons. I certainly think anyone who's ever been involved with patient care, even if you decide I don't want to be a clinician, learning how to relate to people, talk to people from all different walks of life that are not in your bubbles is incredibly useful. I always say I've worked at 3 different VA hospitals working with like low-income veterans. And I decided that's not the ideal setting for me. But I learned a ton, and there's a lot in terms of, communication and relatability and empathy that are valuable there. And to your point, because paths aren't linear, maybe the bouncing around helps you iterate, right? Like working and consulting for a startup that ends up being connected to the firm that you eventually end up working with. So such a beautiful and robust story in terms of where you got to your point today.